Okay, so two things I'm going to try and do in the next 40 minutes. As Janet said, a bit of an update on previous data that we've published. Not radical changes, so it's not going to be the most exciting bit of the presentation, really. So what I really wanted to do was to pull some conclusions out of the findings, which point to how to get more out of creativity. So you're going to see some real echoes with what Paul's already said, but also some real echoes with what Donald and James have yet to say, because I think we're all kind of exploring different databases, but coming to very similar conclusions about what to do. Thank you very much. Let's put it on screen. Okay. So just to reiterate, you know the IPA database, don't need to go through that. We've got about 1,000 case studies. When we look at creativity data, we've got more than 400 going back over about 18 years or so. So it's a pretty robust database. But obviously within the creativity database, we're able to do two things, to compare creatively awarded case studies with those that are not. And indeed, we can go a little bit deeper in that. We can look at levels of creative awards to see if more creativity is better than less. When we talk about creativity, we are using the most respected database there is in the world, which is the Gunn Report database. It is the most objective data you can get anywhere on creativity. Everyone always says to me, yeah, but creativity is such a subjective thing. How do you measure it? Well, the Gunn Report measures the Creative Award wins across the top 56 shows, is it, Don? 46 shows worldwide. So it's the wisdom of the creative crowd. You know, the judges on these awards are very experienced creative people, very experienced clients who know a lot about creativity. So it's their judgment we are buying on what is creative and what is not. And I don't think probably you can get any better than that. It's the nearest thing to objectivity. Plus just one chart. I'm going to use some Australian data from the ADMA, partly because it enables me to look in slightly closer detail at one issue that I want to, but also because this particular database has some astonishingly fantastic campaigns in it, which I think both Donald and James will touch on in their presentations. It has precisely the kind of creativity that I'm going to be advocating to you in there. So it's a great database. And there's about 230. I'm just updating it at the moment. There's going to be around about 400 case studies soon in their database. So it's going to be pretty much similar size to the UK one. Points in exactly the same direction. But okay, we're talking about business results, not just prizes. I'm going to use the efficiency metric quite a lot in my presentation for a reason that is going to become really, really obvious any second now. So efficiency is a bang for bucks measure. It relates outputs in the sense of share growth to inputs in the sense of a measure of budget. I'm not going to dwell on the budget, but it's a measure of share of voice related to share of market, which is the best measure we have of expenditure. I'm also going to look at number of very large business effects once or twice, just as another measure that correlates with share growth. Now, the reason I'm going to particularly focus on efficiency is the unfortunate feature of this data, and it's always been the case and it's not changing. It's also true of the Australian data, so I'm spotting a bit of a pattern here, is that creativity is almost always starved of budget. The great thing about creativity, as we're going to see, is it's fantastically effective. The dumb thing about creativity is clients say, oh, fantastic, I'm getting terrific sales growth. I'll just bank the extra budget that I might have spent. I'll just put it on the bottom line, make friends with the finance director, great bonus at the end of the year, fantastic. Which is what clearly often happens, and it's a really, really dumb thing to do because you're missing out on a huge opportunity for growth. But the average creatively awarded campaign in our database here had an ESOV, that's the difference between share of voice and share of market, our measure of investment, of around about 4.5%. Okay. Our non-awarded ones had a ton more money. This is an enormous difference. It's probably the biggest difference of any kind of two groups that we can compare within the database. So these guys are getting about 9 points of ESOV more money behind them. This is an enormous difference. So by rights, these guys, the non-creatively awarded campaigns, should be walking all over the creatively awarded campaigns. As we're going to see, they don't, but we have to bear this in mind. That's why I look at efficiency as a metric. The efficiency obviously takes account of this. Efficiency takes account of the budget and relates, growth back to budget. When we look at all the other metrics that it would be really, really interesting to know more about, unfortunately, we have to bear this in mind, that we can't expect too much from the creatively awarded campaigns because they haven't had any money spent behind them. So a quick reminder of the strengths of creativity. Firstly, let's just remind us about how creativity works, because that's critical, I think, to how we get most out of it. The first is pretty obvious. That is, the creatively awarded campaigns compared to their non-awarded brethren are massively more likely to be emotional in their modus operandi. So they're seeking to change the way we feel about the brands as opposed to the way we think. They're not giving us information, they're giving us a feeling, a warm glow, whatever the emotion is about that brand. Much more likely. 55 plays 38. The other end of the spectrum, rational, reason why kind of advertising, product benefits, features, prices, deals, all of those kinds of things. These non-awarded campaigns are almost twice as likely to be that kind of advertising as our creatively awarded ones. So by and large, creativity operates in the world of emotions, and that's of course important to effectiveness, because as you will all know who have ever read any of the documents that Les and I have thrust at you over the years, you'll know that emotions are massively more efficient than reason why kind of advertising, to the tune of about 2 to 1. So there's a big, big uplift just by getting emotional. Now, I'm going to argue to you that it doesn't begin to explain why creative campaigns are as effective as they are, but it's part of the explanation. I think the more important thing is the link with fame. So creatively awarded campaigns, about 1 in 2 of them have major fame effects. With non-awarded campaigns, that is about half as much. So creativity is really strongly linked to fame. Fame is about getting brands talked about, buzz, word of mouth, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So YouTube views, all of those very, very familiar pass-along kind of metrics that we are quite rightly interested in these days, because they're all good measures of fame. So creatively awarded campaigns are a big driver of fame. Not surprisingly, people like to pass on ads that are very creative. They're original, they're different. We haven't seen them before. Those are the kind of criteria that creative judges are looking for, and they're also the kind of criteria that make consumers want to pass along an ad. What would be the point in passing along an ad that was boring, unoriginal, seen it all before? You know, it makes kind of sense, doesn't it? So creatively strongly linked to fame. Fame, again, as many of you will know who've suffered Les and my relentless tomes on this issue, fame, you will know, has a huge uplift on efficiency. It's more than 2 to 1. It's about 3 to 1, in fact. So looking across that whole period of time. But as we're going to see, there are time trends in all of this as well. So we've got a huge uplift of about 3 to 1 by being good at generating this buzz effect, this pass-along effect. That alone, I think, doesn't entirely explain things. There's multipliers at work. But the benefit of both emotions and fame is they all play to a profitability agenda. So fame in particular almost doubles our likelihood of generating major profit impact if we look back over our 30-year run of data. So it's pretty good. So not surprisingly, we would expect creativity to have a pretty impressive uplift on efficiency. And indeed it does. It's about 10 to 1 if we look back over our 18 years or so of data that we have. So we've got just about a 10 to 1 multiplier here. So a large part of that, in fact, the only way you can really explain this is that we are using fame as in a lethal way. We're not just availing ourselves of that 3 to 1 multiplier that fame can give us, but we're putting fame on steroids, effectively. These kind of creative campaigns don't only drive a fair amount of buzz, they drive an enormous amount of buzz. They get vastly shown and shared around. And one or two case studies I'll come back to, which I think are good illustrations of this. So a really good creatively awarded campaign drives a lot of buzz. But the quid pro quo of that, of course, is that if we want to get the most out of creativity, we need to find ways to maximize that kind of sharing, pass-along effect. And that is, I think, a really, really interesting development that's coming along, that's gradually happening. And that I'm going to come back to in just a sec. Let's just look at a few other metrics. And bear in mind here, we have to aim off for the budget effect here. So we're not going to see such amazing uplifts when we look at the base levels. So for that reason, I'm just going to compare 2 different budget groups, low budget and high budget. And bear in mind that a lot of these case studies here actually have negative ESOV. But despite that, they generated quite an impressive uplift. So this is our growth uplift. I'm comparing creatively awarded campaigns with non-awarded campaigns and looking at what kind of difference they've generated. So these guys, it's about 18% difference amongst this group of campaigns with low budgets. So that's pretty impressive. The reason I'm doing this, of course, is to make the budget levels roughly similar. There are differences here. The creatively awarded campaigns do still have the disadvantage, but it's nothing like as big as if I bunch them all together. If we look at higher budget creative campaigns, they have an even bigger advantage. It's more than 20% is the uplift. And this is also evidence of another feature, which is about kind of the level of budget you need to prime. Creativity benefits from expenditure behind building the fame effect. The more we can do to fan the flames of fame, try saying that after a few drinks later on, the more we get out of it. And I'm going to come back to that point later on. So it's not just coming up with a great creative idea, it's how we get more out of it. That takes some money, but it also takes creative use of media and media channels. Pricing, another important thing we can look at both. So there's a modest uplift on pricing impacts with low budget, but then pricing impacts are very long-term things, and you have to be spending behind your campaign for quite a time before you get significant profit uplifts. And bigger budgets are more likely to have done that. So these big budget creative campaigns have an enormous impact on pricing effects, taking them from about 3 to 9, which is a huge, huge impact. So we're not only driving volume growth with creativity much more efficiently, but we're also driving pricing enhancements much, much more powerfully than we would otherwise. So it's a kind of double whammy at work, which is one of the great benefits of creativity. Now, I've tried to put those two in context, because it's terribly difficult to do, because, of course, with volume effects, like I've got my efficiency metric, which I haven't got for pricing. But if you take a bunch of case studies all around about the zero ESOV, so they've all got budgets that are very slightly above or below stasis level. And this brings me to very, very comparable levels of budget between creative and non-creative campaigns. You can see that, in fact, the uplift you get from creativity is about twice as big on pricing effects as it is on volume effects. So, and we've seen that our impact on volume effects is pretty bloody impressive, because we were looking at a 10 to 1 multiplier earlier on. So I think if we were able to play the same trick properly with pricing effects, we'd be looking at it certainly at least as big an effect on pricing as that 10 to 1 multiplier we saw on volume. So, it's a kind of no-brainer that we should all be trying to develop creativity. It just shifts almost all of the metrics, and in particular it shifts the metrics that matter most, volume and pricing, because they're the ones that really add up to profitability, assuming, of course, we're putting some money behind the campaign. Now, I said earlier that we can look not just at creativity versus non-creative, we can look at levels of creativity. So that's the data you've already seen. This is our efficiency metric again, bang for bucks. So non-creatively awarded get a rather modest 0.2. So again, we know that overall creatively awarded campaigns are about a factor of 10 uplift on that, very close echo of what Paul was saying earlier. If we look at slightly creative campaigns, you pick up 1 to 4 of the major awards that Donald and the Gunn report measure, we can see a pretty impressive uplift there. It's about 9 to 1, something like 8 or 9 to 1. If we look at the really powerful creative campaigns, the ones that pick up lots of creative awards, 5 or more around the world, they are off the scale, frankly. I mean, you do the maths, it's a massive, massive uplift. These are awesomely efficient campaigns, and we should all be trying to do these. And they do, many of these campaigns do the kinds of things that I'm going to be arguing for, and Donald is going to be arguing for, and James is going to be evidencing later on. So it's not just about creativity, but how we use creativity, which I'll come to in a minute. Creativity is getting more powerful, and this is part of the clue to how I think we need to make creativity work harder. So if I split my data run into the first half and the second half, which pretty much conveniently equates to the pre-digital era and the post-digital era, or the digital era, you can see that up to 2002, creatively awarded campaigns were about, they were pretty damn efficient. They had a level on average of about 1.5. But more recently, that has more than doubled. It's more than doubled in the digital era for very good reasons connected with the digital era. Why? And I think the only way you can possibly explain, firstly, why and how creativity is so powerful, but secondly, why it's getting more powerful, and why, as Paul argued, creativity is becoming more and more important, a bigger multiplier, if you like, in effectiveness, is because of how the digital world has impacted how we exploit creativity. So back in the old days, pre-digital era, Creatively awarded campaigns always enjoyed a bigger fame effect than non-creative. They were the campaigns that people talked about in pubs and bars and here, there, and everywhere. But of course, since then, people have got lots more ways to share their enthusiasm for campaigns, particularly social media, YouTube, and the like. So if you look at what's happened since then, both have grown, as you would expect. Even non-creative campaigns get a significant benefit from the digital world. They can create more of a multiple for what they do. But the creative campaigns are particularly capable of taking advantage of that. So they are the ones that really are fishing in the world of fame, in that pool of fame. And in fact, I mean, increasingly, they are shutting out the case studies that are not creative. It's getting more and more difficult to generate those big buzz effects or getting your share of buzz if you're non-creative than if you're creative. So, you know, the clear indication is that if you want to get all the benefits of fame, which are huge, you really also need to be creative and not just play the fame game in all the various ways you can. Now, I'm going to come to talk at long last about how to make campaigns even more, I think, effective, even more profitable. And I'm going to refer to something called the all guns blazing, which Donald will talk to you more about. So all guns blazing are campaigns that, you know, use multiple channels. They don't just do a TV commercial, but they'll use integrated online. They'll use the full panoply of channels and creativity. So these are what I would tend to recall rich multi-channel campaigns. Different view of creativity. It's not just a great, perhaps, TV spot that happens to virally spread through the ether, but it's a planned process in which you have an idea which works across multi-channels and which kind of functions as a brand idea, an organizing idea for a multi-channel approach. So you can compare creatively awarded campaigns that used only advertising, traditional advertising channels, so TV particularly, but press, posters, cinema, all the ones we know and love, with those that also used online. And within that, obviously, social is an important medium within that. So things like YouTube and so forth are a very important part of that online presence. So you can see a very significant uplift. I mean, this, of course, applies to all campaigns, but it particularly applies to creative campaigns. So the all guns blazing approach, which if you like is the dark green bar, are significantly more effectiveness in terms of business effects reported, which is what we're looking here on this chart, on this particular bar. Sorry, fame effects, I beg your pardon. We're looking at fame effects. They're particularly more likely to drive fame, also very much more likely to be effective. They're also very much more likely to drive major pricing impacts, about 3 to 1. So the all guns blazing approach punches the fame button, it punches the pricing button, both of which are, of course, really important to effectiveness, and as we'll see, generally present a much more effective way forward. But there's a big but to everything I have said so far, which is the but that Janet alluded to up front. I've given you a pretty rosy picture so far of how creativity works, how it's getting more effective, how everything's green lights, green lights, green lights all the way. There is a big but, and it's actually a very, very important but in the modern era, because we live in an era where people are measuring success by shorter and shorter periods. As we approach the era of big data, we're going to be measuring success over microseconds and milliseconds, which scares the hell out of me. It scares the hell out of me because most of the drivers of long-term effectiveness don't work particularly strongly over the short term. And that's absolutely true of creativity in the same way that it's true of fame and emotions, which are all interlinked. So let's just have a look at the scale of the problem here. So here we're looking at what Les and I now refer to as activation effects. This is a basket of short-term effects, everything from kind of click-throughs and search responses right through to online transactions. But these are all very, very short-term effects. If you are a creatively awarded campaign, you are massively less likely to drive these kinds of big responses than if you are non-creatively awarded. And there's good reasons behind that. Creativity takes time to work. Also, it needs budget, and of course, we're not getting that here. But non-creatively awarded campaigns are generally going to produce these kinds of short-term results more powerfully. And the ultimate in dull advertising, the reason why kind of campaigns with product benefits and product features and deals and promotions and all of that kind of stuff, they are really good at driving short-term effects. As it happens, they're shit at doing anything else, but they're really, really good at driving short-term effects. They underperform in every other way we can look at, accept this. And of course, unfortunately, all eyes are on these kind of short-term effects. So we really need to be aware of this. I mean, it's not to say that creativity doesn't produce short-term effects. It does, and it does produce uplifts to them, but just not on the scale that these kinds of approaches do. So we always need to bear this in mind. Creative campaign sales effects are not short-term. So if you look at how they pan out over a period of time, you see creatively awarded, in fact, start from behind. And I'll give you some Australian data in a moment to evidence that. But creatively awarded campaigns start from behind. At about 6 months, they start to accelerate ahead of non-awarded campaigns. And thereafter, it's a race to the top. Creatively awarded campaigns just accelerate away. So here we're looking at in terms of share growth, share effects. We can look at other effects. Here we're looking at broader business effects metrics, which again, you can see an acceleration there, whereas in fact, non-awarded campaigns tend to plateau. But of course, bear in mind budget effects here. You know, if these guys were getting the same kind of budget as here, you'd see a much, much bigger acceleration away. But you've always got to bear in mind, if you're judging success in periods of less than 6 months, and if you have clients who work by the quarter, which a lot of US clients obviously do these days, you're particularly scuppered. I mean, it's well known, most US clients have a very jaundiced view of creativity. They say it doesn't sell. And of course, if you judge success by the quarter, you're absolutely right. It doesn't sell. It doesn't sell in a quarter. Creativity tends to play out strongly over a much longer time period. And we just have to keep focused on that longer time period. And that is not to say that we have the right to expect no results in the short term. We don't. Creativity should be driving some quite good short-term results, but it just won't work as hard as other approaches. I said I'd give you some Australian data. The Australian data is useful in this respect because there are a lot more short. So it's an annual competition, so most of the case studies are over 12 months, and an awful lot of them, about 2/3, are less than 6 months. So I've got a lot of data, which I haven't got with the IPA data, to enable me to cut it. So I'm just very simply, same metric, number of top box business effects that we've been looking at with the IPA data. They measure it in exactly the same way. We're just going to compare quite simply case studies that ran for less than 6 months, and the average here is about 3 months, as opposed to the IPA, where there aren't many below 6 months, with those that lasted for more than 6 months, where it's typically about 8 or 9 months. So if we look at less than 6 months, you can see that creatively awarded campaigns underperform their non-creative counterparts. And bear in mind, these are some pretty amazingly effective campaigns. You're going to hear James talking about Dumb Ways to Die as a case study. I think Donald's going to talk about the car creation campaign for an insurance company in Australia. They are both in this case study database, and they are both awesomely creative. Fantastic. They do not win out over less than 6 months, those kind of campaigns. If you take a slightly longer view, and bear in mind this is only up to 12 months, if you're able to, if they measured it over an even longer period of 12 months, of 2 years or so, we'd be seeing even bigger differences. But you can see the creatively awarded campaigns just start to take off, and they keep going there on after. So we do have to be really careful of this. But we can't just ignore it. I'll come back to that. We can't bury our head in the sand and say, well, clients just ought to be smart. The efficiency boost grows over time, of course, a quid pro quo of that. So to come back to Paul's point, we do see, about 10 to 1. It's growing over time in both senses, growing over time as the years go by, as well as in terms of how long the campaign runs. So 1-year campaigns, the boost between creatively awarded and non-awarded campaigns is about 940% in terms of efficiency. So almost 10 to 1. If you take a slightly longer view over 2 years, it's about 15 to 1. So it just keeps on getting better. So there's an obvious solution. I'm not going to suggest for a moment that the answer to this is that we simply say to our clients, don't be idiots. There's no point in measuring the effectiveness of creativity over 3 months. Just sit tight and wait, because their bosses will have fired them by the time it comes. So we have to do something about it. We have to have the argument about the long-term impacts of creativity, sure, but we have to activate like hell. Clearly, we've got to cover our short-term backsides, as it were, and create what I am suggesting is the ideal solution here, which is a highly creative, all guns blazing kind of approach to brand building. So we're not just going to do a great TV spot and hope that that kind of does its stuff out there. We are going to put in place all of the online, particularly collateral, that drives ever more success out of that creative campaign. But we also need to put in place an integrated activation program that converts that growing enthusiasm to the brand in terms of short-term sales. Just a bit of evidence for that, and this is a slight build on the chart I showed you before. So if we look at creatively awarded campaigns that only did brand building versus those that also did activation, you'll see in common with all kinds of campaigns, there's a big uplift in terms of their short-term activation effects. So we really can, and this doesn't entirely close the gap. You know, we've done a lot to close the gap with boring, plonky old reason why campaigns by activating around them. But that is still, I will warn you now, not as effective in the short term as doing a boring, plonky old reason why campaign. So we still have to bear that in mind, but we really have to do that. You can't expect a client to sit around twiddle his thumbs for 6 months waiting for stuff to come through. That's a really significant and important uplift in short-term effects. But of course, we also get a big long-term uplift as well, because the benefit of doing the activation alongside the brand is at all time scales, we're converting growing enthusiasm for the brand into sales more powerfully. So we're not just doing it in the short term, we're also doing it in the long term. So you need to do both. It's a no-brainer. Do the brand piece, but activate around it. And I think that has really important implications for the way we go about developing creative ideas and putting together campaigns. Because we need creative ideas that lend themselves to activation and lend themselves to multi-channel, because they're both kind of related. Activation relies increasingly on a multi-channel approach, but also the exploitation of the creative idea also relies on a multi-channel approach. That's why I think that the so-called all guns blazing approach, which Donald will talk to you about, is absolutely the way forward. And you know, there's an enormous amount to be gained by having a look on Donald's website at the kinds of campaigns that are on there, assuming you're lucky enough to be subscribers. So I just wanted to end with 3 thoughts before I make way for other speakers. Firstly, I think creativity, we know is very powerful. I've reprised the data, but we've known this now for 3 or 4 years. Hugely powerful, but it does need integrated activation, or we expose our short-term derrieres, big time. So please remember that and work and think about how to activate around it. Creativity benefits hugely, as you've seen, from a multi-channel, all guns blazing kind of approach, which Donald will talk about. You know, I think we shouldn't regard the job as done until we've put all of that all guns blazing work in place. Coming up with a great TV idea is only half the job now, frankly. The job's got much bigger, and we need to be sure we're doing all that kind of stuff. And I think it ultimately argues for the evolution of perhaps a new kind of creative idea, more or less a brand idea led. I love the Axe example because it all starts with a fantastic idea of what that brand stands for. You know, and Axe has been generating effectiveness case studies for more than a decade, primarily, I think, because they have such a powerful start point, success in the mating game. It's endlessly renewable. It's an endless kind of chain of wonderfully sexist ideas that delight young men and older ones too. So it's, you know, if you've got that great territory, you've got a really good brand idea and a sense of what the brand stands for, as VW do as well. VW has a really powerful idea of what VW-ness is about, as anyone will tell you who's ever worked with them. And it shows in the creative work. They're a hugely creative client. So I think it argues for a different kind of creative idea, not just a great TV idea, but an idea that will lend itself, yes, to a great TV spot, but great exploitation, you know, here, there, and everywhere. That's me done. Thank you very much.